Hello all, and welcome to the first of two lectures on the life in the city in ancient Rome. Let's begin. So first of all, let's talk about exactly how many people were living in ancient Rome. Remember from our government lecture, the census only counted adult male citizens. This leaves out non-citizen males, women, children, and slaves, who were the majority of the population. This means that all population figures are heavily estimated. Most scholars have come to the consensus that the population of Rome would be around 1 million people at its height. The height of Rome is considered to be the 1st century BCE to the 2nd century CE. This very large population makes Rome unique among ancient civilizations. No other Western city seems to have reached this size for nearly 2,000 years. Romans had to struggle with certain types of urban problems, such as crowding and sanitation, that no other people had to contend with until recently. Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, therefore at the height of Rome, speaks of the large amount of people in the city. Think about this city of ours. Here, the crowd flowing like a rushing river without stop along its wide streets is crushed together whenever something blocks the path. In this city, 3 theaters are needed to contain its population. Indeed, here the population is so large that it consumes whatever food is harvested in every part of the world. When Seneca says, the crowd flowing like a rushing river without stop along its wide streets, he's indicating the fact that the streets were so packed that they looked like a rushing river. When he says that 3 theaters are needed to contain the population, this is another indicator of how many people were in Rome, as the average Roman theater could hold 20,000 people. As the theater was open to everyone, and not just restricted to citizen men, the fact that it took 3 theaters to satisfy the people of Rome means that there were a lot of people in Rome. And finally, the third highlighted section, that the people consume whatever food is harvested in every part of the world, indicates that although Rome was agricultural, the land around it was swampy and did not produce enough food to feed the city. Hence why Ostia was so important. Food would be imported from around the world, unloaded at Ostia, and put on smaller ships and carried up the Tiber to Rome. But what was living in this city really like? Let's look at some literature for examples. In the literary things that we read in Harvey, there were many different depictions of what life on the street would have been like. The typical Roman street was filled with pedestrians, litters for the magistrates who didn't want to walk among the crowds, the lictors of the magistrates, whether on foot or on litters, who would use their fasces to part the crowd so that their magistrate would not be tousled by the crowd. At night, carts would be added to this, because in the day they were banned from the streets to help with crowding, as Harvey's selection number 150 tells us. Shop owners and vendors would be advertising their wares at the tops of their voices, which Harvey number 150 also tells us, trying to attract the passerby to buy their wares. The lessons of school teachers were mingled among these, as there were no school buildings, which we will learn a little bit later. Religious processions, both from state religion or mystery cults, like the one depicted to be number 151, would be mixed among these, same with funeral processions. Also, law cases were judged out in the open, often in the forum itself, so that anyone could gather and watch. Trials often took on the nature of public spectacles. While Pompey tried to combat this crowding by building sidewalks, which you can see in the image on your screen, with so much going on, it was very common to get injured just walking down the street. As Aldrete pointed out, the majority of lawsuits were because someone threw something out of a window and hit someone on the street. Thus, this led Juvenal in Harvey number 150 to describe what walking down the street was like. The wave of people in front of us blocks us as we try to hurry along. Meanwhile, the mass of humanity behind us gives our groin a jab to get us moving. One guy strikes me with his elbow. Another pokes me with the hard pull of the litter he is carrying. Someone else brings his 2x4 down on my head, while another whacks me with the 10-gallon jug he is carrying. My legs are crusted in mud. Before moving on to the risks of city life, I want to add 2 brief interludes on education, 3 brief interludes on education, medicine, and death, and then burial in ancient Rome, as these were 3 aspects of life that are deeply ingrained in the city. We will save a discussion of the graffiti from Harvey for class. But before moving on to this, let's see how HBO's Rome depicts the streets. It is almost as if this scene was copied from Juvenal's account. But now let's move on to education. So first you started with informal education, which was usually from the time a child was born / able to talk until the age of 7. Rich families often had slave teachers, known as the paedagogus, plural paedagogi, living in their homes. This was an educated Greek slave who would give the boy his preliminary instruction in Latin and Greek. Their main duty was to look after and protect the child, which meant that the boy was always accompanied by his paedagogus. His duties included to restrain and discipline the mischievous child. Some Romans even looked back at their paedagogus with fondness. For example, Augustus was one of many who freed his old tutors out of gratitude. In early Roman history, formal education, starting at the age of 7, was done informally at home by the father. Harvey number 96 tells us one incident of this. This is a passage from Cato the Elder, who decided to educate his son at home. He states he did not think it was right that his son, be in a debt of thanks to a slave for something as valuable as the education of his son. Cato therefore taught his son grammar, law, and athletics. As far as athletics were concerned, he not only taught his son how to throw a javelin, to fight in armor, and to ride a horse, but also how to box, to endure heat and cold, and swim through the eddies and rough waters of the swift Tiber River. He himself claims how he wrote his histories in his own hand with large letters so that his son might have at home the resources necessary to learn about Rome's ancient traditions and heroes. In this early era, a basic level of literacy and military training was the totality of education thought necessary. It was also restricted to male students. Cato was notoriously anti-Greek, so it's hard to tell whether or not he is a good example of the thoughts of this time or just bringing his own prejudices to bear in his personal life. At the same time, the education that Cato gave embodies the traditional Roman way, prep for the military, but also a strong connection to the ancestors and glory of old Rome. In Harvey number 97, the orator Quintilian speaks on his ideas of early education. This passage from the late 1st century author Quintilian shows the importance of having a good paedagogus, since educational theory supported learning Greek first, as Latin would be spoken at home. The second passage shows the importance of fostering enthusiasm for education, which could be a reason why men had such a strong relationship with their paedagogus. Continuing in Harvey number 99, Quintilian speaks about the characteristics of a bad paedagogus, which could lead to unhappy memories of early childhood education and a lack of enthusiasm for later education. He states, the worst pedagogy were the ones who have received an education barely beyond learning the alphabet, but believe incorrectly that they have a more profound knowledge. These often think it below their dignity to play the part of teaching, and instead believe that they are now in the position of authority over the child, an idea pedagogy often arrogantly take on, and assume a domineering and sometimes cruel attitude as they pass on their stupid notions to the child. Therefore, to achieve these goals, a paedagogus needs to have more of an education than just letters. Pedagogy who think they know more than they do often treat children poorly. At the age of 7, in the Republic and on, children would enter their formal education. This began first with the teacher known as the literator. So formal education began at age 7, but only for wealthy families. Teachers were not a family member, but a man who made individual contracts with parents to instruct their children. These men didn't have formal school buildings, but instead would conduct class in a public portico or the corner of the forum. Hence Marshall's complaint that the teacher yells all day. The curriculum of the Literatur included reading, basic writing, math, and history. The public nature of this education would have made for a distracting environment, since the teacher and students might have found themselves trying to hold classes surrounded by the bustle of people buying and selling, or officials conducting state business or trials. Unlike all other levels of education, this level of education was open to both boys and girls. At around 14 or 15, the boys, but rarely girls, began rhetorical training under the Grammaticus. Under this person's tutelage, students improved their reading, writing, and speaking skills. They read and memorized great works of literature and philosophy, especially those works with moral lessons. The last couple years of this education focused on literature, particularly Homer and Roman historical literature. Under both the Literatur and the Grammaticus, there were no chalkboards or paper. Instead, students had small wooden tablets with a shallow indentation filled with wax to write on. These were reusable since texts were extremely expensive and fragile. Only the teacher would have access to any real texts. Therefore, much of Roman education consisted of teachers reading aloud from these texts and the students memorizing the long passages by heart. If a student failed to perform properly, both Literatur and the Grammaticus would beat them brutally. The teacher had a wide range of punishments available. Thus, it's not surprising that many Romans' memories of school were not pleasant. Classes lasted from dawn until noon, but there were some holidays when the students got off of class. The main break was summer vacation, which usually started early June and lasted until about the middle of October, but it was not a fixed schedule. This depended on the individual teacher. There is an anecdote of a zealous Grammaticus who kept his students in class almost all the way through July. This summer break schedule was usually so that the students could help with the family farm and harvest and then return back to their education. After the Literatur and Grammaticus, families hoping that their child would embark upon a public career often sent their child to a professional teacher of oratory, known as the rhetor. Therefore, this level of education was only for the aristocracy. Since everything about Roman life was public, the ability to get up in public and persuade others of your opinion was a highly prized talent. As the epitaphs in Harvey number 102 show, teachers were generally of low social status and relied upon the fees that they charged their pupils in order to survive. Yet the fact that they could afford tombstones puts them above the poorest of the Romans, as we will learn shortly. In Harvey number 100, we have an example of a teacher punishing his students. Marshall writes, "Not yet have the crested roosters broken the silence when you are already thundering with your savage yellings and beatings as loudly as the bronze echoes with hammering strokes when the artist attaches the bronze image of a lawyer to the statue of his horse. The shouting in the Colosseum is quieter when a victorious gladiator's fans cheer him on." Marshall makes sure to note the public setting of this as the teacher wakes him up, as well as how loud the teacher is scolding. He is louder than the crowd in the Colosseum. Although Quintilian in Harvey number 101 discourages the teachers from beating their students, the amount of accounts of beatings we have suggests that this might just be Quintilian's opinion and not what was actually practiced. In Harvey number 104, Quintilian complains that grammatici have started taking over some of the subjects usually taught by rhetors. As mentioned before, the Grammaticus was supposed to improve students' reading, writing, and speaking skills, and in the last few years, literature, particularly Homer, and Roman historical literature. Yet, Quintilian describes how grammatici have begun teaching public speaking in the topic of character description and persuasion, areas which the greatest burden is placed upon the speaker. This was because rhetors found these subjects below their professional ability. This led to advanced students being held back in their education because they had to start learning oratory from the Grammaticus instead of moving on to the more advanced rhetor. Speaking of rhetors, Harvey number 103 is the advice of Pliny on picking a good rhetor for his friend's son. He states, "And so we must look around for a Latin rhetorical trainer whose school should be a model of severity, modesty, and especially moral correctness, a guardian and a moral trainer. Your son will hear nothing from this man except for the things by which he will profit. He will learn nothing that he would be better off not learning. He will hear from Genitor no less than he would from you or me of how he must live up to his ancestors' and family's legacy. This letter emphasizes that the education received from a rhetor is not just in oratory and public speaking. As Pliny says, a good rhetor is a model of severity, modesty, and moral correctness, a guardian and moral trader. Therefore, a rhetor would not only teach a young man how to speak, but also how to live up to his ancestors' and family's legacy. Now let's move on to health and medicine, which were another scene you could see on the street. So Romans got their ideas about medicine from the Greeks, and one of the most important doctors / minds for the medical field was Aristotle and his idea of the 4 elements. Aristotle believed that all things were composed of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. These produced in the human body 4 corresponding forces or fluids called humors: dry, moist, hot, and cold. The equilibrium of these humors determined the health of the body. The ideal combination was one that favored hot and dry, and the worst was moist and cold. The Greeks believed that men were superior, hence their bodies were considered hot and dry. Women, who were inferior, were consequently dominated by moist and cold humors. When a person's humors got out of balance, it caused disease. Thus, much of a doctor's practice was devoted to restoring balance among the humors. In early Rome, there was much disdain for doctors. And because of this, literature from this early time is filled with preference for folk remedies, like Cato's cabbage, which he saw as a cure-all for everything. One thing that permeates Roman medical thought is the belief that diseases of the body were caused by diseases of the soul. Problems with the mind cause problems with the body. They posited links between virtue and good health and between immorality and disease. This meant that the only real need for doctors was for problems clearly not caused by behavior. These include injuries such as trauma, broken bones, cuts, and wounds received in war. The patients of doctors were also, for the most part, wealthy, because only the wealthy could afford the doctor's fees, which would be paid either per visit or per disease. Doctors were also not certified, trained, or schooled, so anyone who wanted to just say could proclaim himself a doctor and set up practice. Despite this disdain toward doctors, we have 2 examples of influential doctors from Rome. The first is Celsus, who was interested in the psychological aspects of medicine. He thought that the outcome of a case depended equally on 3 factors: A, the patient, B, the doctor, and C, the disease. Galen was idealistic and thought that the best physician was half doctor and half philosopher. He thought that to understand how the body worked, one had to practice dissection, but because there were moral prescriptions against cutting up humans, he had to experiment on animals. His animal of choice was the ape, because he thought that they were most like humans. He criticized doctors who did not study anatomy for their ignorance. Surgery was really only prevalent in the army. Most doctors stuck to treatments based on plants and potions, but in the army, each legion had 1 or more doctors. Since wounds that penetrated the abdomen and chest were fatal, the army doctor mostly stitched up shallow cuts, set broken bones, and amputated severely injured limbs. But they also specialized in removing arrows, which was difficult if the arrow was barbed. They either had to pull it all the way through the wound, or use the scoop of Diocles to pull it out. Thus, Roman medicine was fairly primitive. They had no concept of bacterial or viral causes of diseases, and there was not much surgery that could be performed, and doctors relied heavily on magical potions. Despite all this, they did fairly well at treating trauma. And the tools on your screen are actual medical tools that we have found from Pompeii that would have been used. The Roman attitude about the effectiveness of doctors can be seen in this poem by Martial, which is not in either of your readings, but I felt it was worthy of inclusion. Martial states, "I was unwell, but you, Symmachus, immediately came to me, accompanied by 100 students. 100 hands, chilled by the north wind, touched me. I did not have a fever, Symmachus, but now I do." Finally, before we move on to death and burial, let's look at a scene of surgery from HBO's Rome.
this man?
Run, get a doctor.
I don't want people dying in my house.
Do as I say, woman.
There will be copious pus, first putrid, then wholesome, and mayhap fits of the spleen, but that will be all to the good. A purging of the malignancy will follow. This is brass. Come.
When will he wake up?
Today, tomorrow, maybe never. You might try an offering to space. A white rabbit often works. I'll send my boy tomorrow to check the dressings.
As you can see, surgery was pretty much just cutting. While they didn't necessarily do brain surgery like this, surgeries probably did happen quite often in people's homes, on the street, etc. In addition, the prognosis, or the final outcome, was probably quite similar to what the doctor says here. He may or may not wake up, and you should probably go make an offering to the gods just in case. Finally, let's move on to burial, as burial was also a big part of the daily life in Rome, both in the landscape and in what was actually happening on the streets. The Romans had enormous reverence for their ancestors, who were the focal point of family rituals. Because of this, it is no surprise that death and burial were the subject of a great concern to the Romans. Despite this reverence and concern, however, when a Roman died, the fate of their body depended on their economic status in life. For example, the Puticuli are the modern names for the open pits in which the very poorest of Romans, who couldn't afford a proper burial, were thrown. They were located just outside the city walls. Some were quite large, and one is estimated to contain 24,000 corpses. The Roman authorities were concerned that having these pits so close to Rome did not reflect well on the city, so they attempted to pass legislation aimed at forcing people to dump their corpses farther away from the city. All around Rome, therefore, there were stones inscribed with Senate decrees ordaining that corpses and garbage be carried farther than that marker. They don't seem to have been very successful. If you were slightly more well off, though not rich, you could join a burial club. In a burial club, you would pay 100 sesterces, which was a fair amount of money for a person of average income, since remember the average income was usually 1 to 4 sesterces a day, and monthly dues into a general pot. If a member of the club died, the others would pay for the funeral expenses. There were elaborate formal rules for precisely what members had to do for each other in terms of burial. For example, a person forfeited their right to burial if they committed suicide, and the distance from the city where the person died changed how their funeral happened. While sometimes this pooled money was used for individual burial plots, a lot of the time a burial club would pool its money and buy a mausoleum where urns containing the ashes of the cremated members could be kept. These were called columbaria and usually dug into the ground. Some were so large that they could hold over 700 urns. One way that the club could earn money was to rent out some of the extra spaces in these columbaria to non-members. However, the main means of burial was individual tombs, if you were wealthy enough to afford them. These tombs were constructed along the roads leading into Rome. Thus, to reach the city of the living, one had to pass through the city of the dead, otherwise known as a necropolis. Tombs were frequently very elaborate and took many forms. The most common type looked like a little house, but they were so varied it is hard to narrow down one tomb type. Tombs often had pipes protruding out of the top of them, with the idea that the family would come from the city to have a picnic on the tomb and share the feast with the deceased by dropping food down the tube and pouring in wine. A person did not build their own tomb, but instead left instructions in their will for their heirs to follow. It was often stipulated in the will that a person could not receive his inheritance until he had buried the deceased in a specified manner. This obsession with tombs was because the standard Roman religious beliefs did not really include a well-developed notion of an afterlife. Romans seemed particularly concerned with leaving some enduring memory of themselves behind, and elaborate tombs were one way to do this. Because of the care taken in building these tombs, they were often looted for their marble or taken over as housing for the poor. While there are no images of Puticuli, here's an image of a columbaria type tomb. Each member of a burial club would get his or her own hole, and the empty holes would be rented out. As Aldrete states, some of these also had dining rooms attached to them, and this one seems to be one of those, as it has a very large space, with what looks like to be a fire pit. Meanwhile, there are tombs of the wealthy scattered around Rome, though all outside of the Pomerium, which is the sacred boundary of the city, as no burials could happen within the sacred boundary. Of the three small photos, the top is the tomb of Claudia Metelli, the middle the pyramid of Cestius, and the bottom the tomb of the baker. Of the two large photos, the top is the mausoleum of Augustus, and the bottom is a small house-shaped tomb found outside Ostia. These examples show the range that tombs took and how more money means a more elaborate tomb. We'll be learning more about tombs during the City Project presentations on Thursday. Finally, funerals also took over the city through the fact that each funeral is accompanied by a funeral procession. These were really only for wealthy people. So the deceased was dressed in fine clothing and had a wreath put on him and was paraded from the house to the forum with his family, friends, and clients. In this parade, the wax masks of illustrious ancestors were placed on living family members, who also dressed up in clothing indicating the highest rank that ancestor had attained. Once they reached the forum, the corpse was placed upright for all to see. The family members wearing the wax masks would sit in ivory chairs near the corpse. One of the sons, or another close family member, would then deliver an eulogy in which he recounted the deeds not only of the deceased, but also the ancestors. Finally, after the eulogy, the procession moved outside the city boundaries where the corpse was cremated and buried. This was not a quiet, solemn procession, but instead, close female relatives were expected to scream, beat themselves, tear out their hair, scratch their cheeks until they bled, roll in the dirt, pound their heads against the ground, etc. The family also hired musicians and sometimes even professional mourners, people who made a living screaming and wailing at funerals as if they were family members. Males were expected to be a little bit more restrained unless it was their son that had died.